Welcome to another Thursday with ThirdPath webinar. Today we'll be hearing from Erin Reid, Assistant Professor of Organizational Behavior at Boston University, and a couple of our wonderful ThirdPath board members, in fact, my two board co-chairs. Ellen Ostrow, a psychologist, consultant, certified mentor coach, and founder of Lawyers Life Coach, and Kathy Kadilak, currently a Virginia Supreme Court certified mediator, and previously, for many years, she managed the U.S. Department of Justice's Work-Life program. Welcome, everybody. We are very excited about today's call. It should be a special treat. Each of our speakers will be helping us discuss some of the most cutting-edge information about work-life integration. I'm confident we will all learn a lot. And like all of our Thursday webinars, we hope today's webinar illustrates why setting win-win boundaries at work brings benefits to the employee and the organization. So Erin, you had a wonderful research that you did that really helped give some light about work-life integration in general and men in particular, published in Harvard Business Review with the title, Why Some Men Pretend to Work 80 Hours a Week. Tell us about that. It was really wonderful to read it, and I'm so glad it was out there and is published for others to read.
Sure. So I'm happy to talk about that. So that study is a big field study of a consulting firm, and the original title of the study was Embracing, Passing, Revealing, and the Ideal Worker Image. And so the ideal worker image, it's this old sociological concept that the most desirable worker is a person who's always available for and primarily committed to their work. And numerous research studies have shown that this expectation is alive in professional jobs where, work routinely spills into evenings and weekends, and advancement and prizes accrue to those who are perceived as most devoted. And scholars have seen this among bankers, surgeons, engineers, academics, priests, and I looked at it with consultants. Existing research tends to focus on women's experiences and to frame the ideal worker image as a problem for women. We tend to assume that men are relatively happy ideal workers. I didn't really believe that when I was in graduate school, and so I did my research on how do men and women, so including men in the question, navigate these expectations that they'd be ideal workers. And so I was very, very fortunate to get access to a strategy consulting firm. I can't disclose the identity of the firm, but it's one of sort of multiple firms that are quite competitive, that hire from good schools, and that sort of compete in this strategy and management consulting space. And so at that firm, I gathered 115 interviews. I spoke with 84 consultants, men and women. I also spoke with other kinds of people at the firm, so administrative assistants, people who had left the firm, people working in IT, people working at other consulting firms. So that was my data set. And I interviewed people about their work history, their experiences with the organization, their future plans, and their personal lives. I was also fortunate enough to get access to their performance data, which became important as I was going through my work. And so basically what I found was that in this firm, people are expected to be an ideal worker. So one person, he told me, people here, we're on our Blackberries, we're thinking about our work 24/7, maybe you tune out for a little while here and there, but we work all the time. You wake up at night, you're dreaming about it. The first thing you do, you pick up your Blackberry, you're on it through the morning, you get to the office, you're working through the day, you sit at your desk, you're canceling plans with friends. And so that was sort of the sense of what it takes to be successful. But what I found was that most people were actually quite unwilling to do this. Even though, and this was interesting to me, even though it was apparent to everyone that this is what you need to do to be successful in consulting, and these people had selected into consulting, most people didn't actually want to do it. And so I found, I guess about a third of people really embraced this. They worked 70 to 80 hours a week. They traveled constantly. The rest of the people strayed. They found ways to cultivate fewer and more predictable work hours and to reduce travel. But they strayed in different ways, and how they strayed turned out to matter a lot. So some people, they did what I called pass, and other people revealed. And men who were straying, so men who were not ideal workers, were more likely to pass than women were. And so passing, what it looks like is, here's a quote from a senior manager. This was in the HBR article, and the media kind of took off with it. But he said, I skied 5 days last week. I took calls in the morning and in the evening, but I was able to be there for my son when he needed me to. I was able to ski 5 days in a row. No one knows where I am. Those boundaries are only practical with my local client base, especially because we're mobile. There are no boundaries. And so I thought this was kind of weird, especially since I had interviewed a whole bunch of people who said you had to work yourself to death to succeed here. So I thought it was interesting that he was able to do this. And when I talked to other people, they described this person to me as a rising star who they thought worked much harder than others. He got the highest performance rating that year, and he was promoted to partner.
Wow. Well, hold on. Just like that's just so interesting and what a contradiction between what you were hearing from him and the description from the organization about him. Wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah. So men who strayed, they tended to find different ways to pass. That's kind of, they weren't all skiing, but they found ways to not work all the time. Women were more likely to reveal, and some men revealed. And I have an example here of a man who revealed. So this is a junior manager, and he said, when my daughter was born, one of the things I wanted to do was take off 3 months, do the full, paternity leave, and be a stay-at-home dad. But the original reaction I actually got was, oh no, you can't take 3 months off. And so he had this sort of back and forth with the HR department. He eventually takes 6 weeks off. He comes back, he works 80 hours a week, and then he's told the firm actually doesn't feel like they can evaluate them because he had a big donut hole in his year. He only worked 52 minus 6 weeks, so not enough. And so he by doing that, he had really revealed that he was unwilling to work all the time, and his performance rating ended up falling that year from a 3 to a 2. He didn't get a promotion that he'd applied for, and he ultimately left. And so I highlight that story because I feel like that's a story we hear a lot from women and less from men. But men who take leaves also end up being penalized.
Yeah.
And so this matters a lot. So the people who embrace, who go along with being an ideal worker, and the people who pass, they're referred to as stars and superheroes. They enjoy direct or accelerated career paths, very high performance ratings. The people who reveal typically had missed promotions, their advancement would slow, they would get put on crappy projects with demanding clients, and they had low performance ratings.
Wow.
So that is the general story, and I have to say I have been so surprised by the reaction to this research. So I wrote the academic article, and then I wrote this Harvard Business Review piece that you mentioned. Since I wrote the Harvard Business Review piece, this piece of research has been profiled in the New York Times 5 times. It seems to be in the media all the time. So people care a lot about this, I guess, is my takeaway. That I've learned that people, care a lot about the fact that men are also having difficulty with these long work hours, and that they may have different coping strategies, and that really, really we need to change the way that we work.
Yeah. Well, there were so many amazing things in this research, but one of the I think it was just amazing to see it in black and white. Takeaways for me was the organization's reaction to your research. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Oh yeah. So I got into this organization because they had a woman problem. They were recruiting women they were recruiting about 35% women. But then women fell out of the pipeline on the way up to partner, and so they had less than 10% of partners were women. So they had this leaky pipeline for women, and they wanted to understand why women weren't sticking around. And they had this working hypothesis that it was about work family. And so I went there with a research team actually, and I said, I'm kind of for my PhD research, I was interested in studying men, and then we could study women as they wanted us to. I could study men. We could put the story together and see what's going on in the organization. And so we told them we ended up finding men and women were actually leaving at the exact same rate. But the pipeline looked leakier for women because the firm never hired women into senior positions. So both men and women left at a rate of about 20% a year. But then the men would they would hire more men into senior positions. So then that was why there was a big disparity at the senior levels.
Huh.
And so that was important, that men were reporting just as much trouble with time demands as women were. Um, and they kind of took that in and they were empathetic to it. And then they said, maybe these guys are just not the guys who we want here. These are not our guys, I think was the exact quote. So they basically, like, they took in the findings, they listened to them, and then they rejected them. And then a few weeks later, I got a phone call from an administrator there saying she was putting together a training session because they want to teach women how to pass. And I was like, that was so not the,
Oh
that's
my
not the takeaway. The takeaway is you should change how you work. You shouldn't be teaching more people how to fake it. But they were just, they felt like they were incapable of changing how they worked, right? This was an individual problem that individuals should solve.
I'd go so far, Erin, as to say is they felt like they really didn't think they had a work problem and that they wanted people to pass because, okay, if you're going to have something else that you want to do, then at least keep it to yourself. Like in other words, they didn't really see themselves having a work problem. Um, is my interpretation incorrect? Like how they were approaching their work, they didn't really see that as a problem.
Well, they were sort of aware that there might be a problem, but they also felt that they were competing with these other firms where people were also working all the time, and that it was not
Mhm.
plausible for them to have a different way of designing their work. And in speaking with people, I found a lot of people feel that way. People in senior roles, like the competition and the fact that everyone else is engaged in this sort of race to the finish. Is meaningful, and it makes it really hard to create change in your organization.
hmm Well, and I would argue there's one one of the themes we're going to hear us talk about today is this concept of chronic overwork. And so I'm going to put a hypothesis on the table that, for us to think in new ways about how to do work effectively, where you meet your client needs but also have a life, you have to have time to actually think and react and change and try things. And one of the big problems of chronic overwork is that people don't have time to actually think of a different way of how to do things that would be just as effective. So I hear you that there is a real problem they're feeling, which is they're competing against other people who are willing to throw huge hours at the client and help the client at the drop of a hat. And then I think they get stuck because they don't actually have time to reflect and think of new ways to do it. And again, there's lots more going on here, but what do you think about what I just said, Erin?
Oh, I think that's true too. I mean, they were like these were, really smart, caring people, and I remember they heard the results and they took them in, and they had this sort of reaction that they couldn't make change. And I think a lot of it was that I would give my research, I gave my research presentation, and then they left and they were just consumed by the next client crisis.
Yes. Yes.
And the people at the senior levels were the most consumed by the client crises, and you know, that was what really mattered, right? You really get your long-term strategy really gets taken up by your short-term choices and
Yeah.
the sort of short-term needs, and it's hard to find space.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's a systemic problem. So it's a little bit about how the organization handles it. It's a little bit about how leaders have learned over years to approach their work, and then how they set up their teams to approach their work. And so it just becomes this. It's a complicated thing to change. And I really like what you've done. Already we're going to come into this call with more empathy for the workplace that you looked at, because it's difficult to make change. And I think that's really important for all of us to hear today, is that it's not simple to make change. And I have a lot of empathy for leaders because it's hard to try to do leadership and just get through the immediate things that you're trying to do. And then what we're saying to them is, hey, by the way, can you make some big changes too? So that's hard. And I appreciate that you've put that on the table today. I think that's important. There's a couple of things I wanted to underscore, which was just, you said it, but I want to underscore when these people were trying these other approaches, but they did it in a way of passing, their effectiveness, their work effectiveness was just as good. So in other words, they weren't compromising getting the work done while passing. They were actually doing an excellent job, or as equally excellent job getting the work done. Is that a correct assessment?
Yes, so their performance ratings were the same and even slightly higher than the people who are actually working all the time. And I think I think that's because they were sleeping more
Yes.
and they were spending more time with their families and they had a little bit more time for creative pursuits. And I think when you're doing knowledge work, there's really only so much time in a day that you can be truly creative, and it's easy to get burnt out.
Yes.
So time away from work is really important in order to have high quality work.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, what a great lead in to the next thing we're going to talk about. So thank you. You've really laid the groundwork for the next part of our call, where I'm going to really have Ellen Ostrow and Kathy Kadilak talk about some of the things we've been learning at ThirdPath. And then after we've talked about a few things, Erin, we'll really look forward to circling back to you and getting your thoughts on how this relates to your work as well. So I'm going to put up a slide, and I'll quickly describe the slide because the idea is that we might actually turn this into just an audio recording. And so then if someone's just listening to this, we want them to be able to hear it. So we're looking at a slide that's got a lot of pink and blue on it, and I do that on purpose. And it's describing a work-first work culture. And what we would argue is that what Erin was looking at was a work-first work culture, meaning it's an organization where the only way you to move to the top is that you put work first your entire career. And so if you were looking at this slide, you would notice that when people join this organization, there's an equal number of pink and blue things, little pegs that I have. I'll talk about the purple ones in a second. By the time you get to the middle level of the organization, there's a few less pink people and still a lot of blue. And when you get to the top level, it's mostly blue. And what we're trying to say in that is that if you want to get ahead in a work-first work culture, you have to move forward in this ideal worker approach. You have to put work first. So only people who don't get distracted or take time to do things that are life responsibilities are able to move ahead. And so those are typically, it's more often men who can do that. And as Erin's pointing out, not because men are equally all happy that that's the case, but that's just the way it plays out, both because of norms at work and norms at home. And so what we're going to talk about today is that there's also different types of work cultures out there. We're going to get to that in a second. But before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about the purple people. If you were looking at the slide, you'd see there's a couple of purple people. Well, they're people who entered the workplace really clear that they wanted to do an excellent job at work, but they also really wanted to have time for their lives outside of work. And so they tried to figure out how to do this. They're the people who were passing or the people who revealed and said, hey, I want to do a great job at work, but I also really want to have time for my life. And what happens is that those people don't really make it to the top of these organizations. Just ideal workers, people who are willing to put work first their entire careers. But what's interesting about this is that, yes, the top leaders really set some norms. There's an expectation of 24/7 responsiveness. It's not unusual to work evenings and weekends and on vacations. But here's what we've been learning, and this is what I'm going to get Ellen and then Kathy to talk about, is that we're starting to see that it perpetuates this problem of chronic overwork. And so it means that you can't really think about how to do work more effectively. And everybody's just reacting to, as for example, Erin talked about, the next crisis. So I'm going to give you some examples of what chronic overwork challenges look like. And then I'm going to stop and say, hey, Ellen, you've been working with a lot of lawyers and law firms, and how much of this do you see in the work that you do? And then I'm going to ask Kathy to talk about, she's had a long history of working with people around these issues and hear what insights she has. So some typical problems from a chronic overwork workplace is that it's a culture of fire drills, no time to actually stop and put some sort of new efficiency in place that would avoid future fire drills. And that when you're flexing, if someone's flexing, often that just means that you're working and then you're working some more at night and over the weekends. Or even what I've been hearing, working while you're on parental leave. And that there's a lot of frustration in particular frustration at people who try to set boundaries at work or who are those ones who reveal. And that basically this also really perpetuates very strong gender norms, not just at the workplace, but also, and I want to underscore this, it perpetuates strong gender norms at home too. So Ellen, is this work first work culture something you're familiar with in the law firm world, and the idea of overwork a problem?
Absolutely. We have some wonderful examples in ThirdPath of lawyers who have chosen to be integrated leaders and to not work like this, but they're very rare, and especially in large firms, I see the culture of overwork all the time. It's interesting because recently I've been working at a firm where all the leaders are women, and the slide of the culture completely fits that.
Yeah.
So it really kind of fits with what Erin is talking about. The associates are men and women, and they're all incredibly frustrated about the inefficiencies.
Yeah.
And the fact that there is a culture of fire drills. But the leadership, just as in the organization that Erin worked with, genuinely believes that work must be done that way.
Yeah.
And is blind to the inefficiencies created by having people overwork. So, when I talk to the associates, they're very clear that their brains are not functioning efficiently when they've had 4 hours of sleep.
Yeah.
But the leadership, there really are people, and they're often at the heads of these organizations, who need very little sleep, who seem to thrive working like this. I can get into the psychology of that, but we don't need to do that. But their own personal experience is that it's necessary, it leads to success, and there is no other way to do this. And why would you even think about another way to do this?
Yeah. Yes. And I think I really appreciate that you pointed out that it's not just a gendered thing, that I believe it's somebody who's worked a certain way their entire career. It's very hard for them to imagine that it could be done differently. And if you've got a whole group at the top who've worked that way, then they can kind of reinforce that assumption with each other too. There might be one more thing you want to add, and then Kathy, I want to hear what thoughts come to your mind as you've been listening today. Any other thoughts?
Well, I just have a question for Erin, which is I wonder about the parameters of passing, because my guess is that there are, I would be curious to know how much can you really put boundaries before it begins to show?
Great question.
So I think that depends a lot on the work context. The people who I described as passing, who were successful, were typically still working between 50 and 60 hours a week.
Mm-hmm.
So they were still working a lot. In that culture, maybe if you really scaled back to 35 or 40 hours a week, it would start to show. But 50 to 60 hours a week is also significantly less than the 70 hours a week that many of their colleagues were reporting. But I think I think it just depends a lot on the context. In this organization, people talked about expressing, realizing they want to spend a lot of time with their family, so deciding that they would specialize in a local industry. And then they could still express this sort of love of their work, and wasn't it convenient that they didn't have to travel very much, which is very different from going to HR and asking not to travel,
Right.
So there were various strategies. I actually interviewed someone for a different project yesterday. He's a he was a journalist, and he was telling me about his career, and he talked about how he had been able to fake it for a while by taking a particular sort of foreign correspondent position, which meant that he wasn't accountable to anyone during the day, and so he ended up taking care of his children actually most of the time, and filing his stories when they were asleep. And he said it was like the greatest job for a dad. And he described it as faking. So I think exactly what passing looks like depends a lot on the particular context. I know, like, I have friends who have lawyers say it's very difficult in law because they're so much more accountable for their time than in consulting.
Interesting.
So,
yeah.
In a billable hours culture.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wonderful. So I want to make sure we get a chance to hear from Kathy. That's a great answer. I think the context of where someone works makes a huge difference. And what's fun, Erin, was what we've seen is those people who are passing at 50 or 60 hours a week are actually helping make change, though, because they have a little bit more room in their heads to think differently. And so we have, I would argue, some people who, a lot, but they're part of the ThirdPath community, and they're helping make change because they're not doing that 60, 70, 80 hours a week. So really just taking it a step back, even in these crazy cultures, means that you can make some big change, or they can get involved with more change. So that's been fun to see. Kathy, as you listen in today, what sounds familiar to work you've been doing over the years around this? Do you have anything hopeful to say? You don't have to. It must be frustrating in some ways to hear the same old, too.
Well, this is true. Can you hear me okay?
Perfectly.
Great. Erin's article really resonated with me, and in a way I'm sorry to say that, because much of what she was discussing in her article I actually saw and experienced 20 years ago. So I was overseeing the Department of Justice's Work-Life Initiative going back to Janet Reno's administration in 1994, 1995, and then for 12 years after that. And, what I saw particularly in the litigating divisions was the same type of reality: chronic overwork, little interest in affording people any form of flexibility. The attitude was, hey, I did this, I lived through it, even though I had children, they can too. So I wonder if part of the problem has to do with the fact that people don't want to find out that they've been doing it wrong for many, many years of their lives, and that they might have missed opportunities they could have had if they worked a little differently. Also, there was a lack of appreciation and value put on keeping employees. Turnover wasn't a big deal to them. I heard top leaders say, hey, there are 100 attorneys waiting for that person's job. So if they burn out, I really don't care. The problem with that thinking is that, of course, turnover is very, very costly in terms of the money and time involved in hiring new people and orienting them, the chaos it creates in the organization among the folks that have to fill in when someone leaves, and also the lack of continuity. So even in the consulting world, because I've worked as a consultant now for several years, you want continuity for your clients. And Robert Reich talked about the importance of the capital that you have and the connections that are made between your staff and your clients. So there's that personal connection that exists that is often very important in maintaining a good client base and good client relationships. So I think if we could define for organizations why it's important to provide people with some level of accommodation in the form of flexibility, which really doesn't cost them anything, to hold on to their top performers and to nurture them, in effect, in terms of having a better balance in life, I think that more and more organizations would get it. I'll give you one really quick example of something that happened, believe it or not, back in the 90s. And for Erin, this might be something she'd want to look into that I could help with. But back in 1995, the FBI did a study on why so many of their young agents were leaving. And they were really, really concerned about this because the FBI invested a lot of money in hiring and training their agents. They did not want them to leave. In fact, they want to hold on to their agents for the life of their careers. So that is one organization that really gets the value of that continuity and having those people on board. So they did a study, and they found out that, especially with the female agents, that they felt that being an agent, a special agent, and a mom were mutually exclusive activities. So they asked them, well, what can we do? And they said, well, if we could work a reduced schedule but still have good assignments that would help us to grow in our careers, we would stay. So they experimented with it, and in fact, it worked. It saved them millions of dollars in turnover. Men took advantage of the program. I'm not sure of the current state of the program, but it was an excellent program, and it was really cutting edge at the time. Nobody in law enforcement was doing part-time programs for their law enforcement officers.
Wow.
So there's an example of an organization that not only got it, but did something about it, and it did, in fact, translate into, revenue success for them.
Wow.
Bottom achievement. So I think when I was thinking about Erin's article and about, what the ThirdPath is doing that I think is so critically important, I think that if we can continue to promote pioneering leaders, you need people. We can have a grassroots revolution, but that in and of itself isn't going to do the trick. We need people in leadership roles, especially men, to step forward and lead by example and demonstrate that you can have a life outside of work, whatever that means to you, and be very effective in your work at the same time.
Yeah.
And I think that's going to be the key. And I think that sometimes that happens because it's informed by life experiences. I know in my course of my career, I've had male leaders I've worked for who had a life experience that helped to define their attitudes about work-life effectiveness. And so I think that as we have more leaders who are more progressive in their thinking and who understand the importance of a full life and perspective, that will make a big difference.
Amen, Kathy. That's awesome. And one of the big reasons why we've been doing some of the work we've been doing with leaders. Thank you so much. And what a nice story. I can count on you to give us a nice, hopeful story about the FBI. That was very interesting to hear about. Thank you. Wonderful. Well, I'm going to keep one eye on the clock and share a couple of quick slides. We're not going to talk a whole lot about them because I want to get to one more point and leave time for questions and answers. So if you were looking at the slide right now, what you'd see is a very different kind of work culture, and that's something that's changed over the last 20 years, Kathy. There probably were some of these people back then too, but what I'm so excited about is we're seeing more and more what I call fully flexible work cultures. There's this one amazing small law firm in Colorado, clearly, just like Kathy said, founded by a leader who really understood this was not a win-lose solution. You could really set up flexibility at all stages for the lawyers, the paralegals, the administrative people. He came with a different solution that worked well for each group of type of work. And in these fully flexible work cultures, what's amazing is what happens is the opposite. It becomes this really beneficial thing for the organization. You develop people's integration skills. We've learned a lot about that at ThirdPath. There's some really excellent skills people can use to be more effective, to have time for work and time for life. And when you learn these skills, you can actually, feel like you're happy with your life and happy with work, and I believe do a better job in both. And so you can create this organization that not only helps people feel more satisfied work and life-wise, but it develops people that really improve these skills. And so you suddenly become this resource in some ways for your community and for other organizations because you're developing well-skilled, integrated professionals who, even if they don't stay, because maybe they've moved or whatever, they've got really good skills about how to do work and life differently. So instead of the purple people leaving, by the time you have created this flexible workplace and people move ahead, you've got a lot of people who really develop those integration skills. And what we're seeing in a fully flexible work culture, and there's quite a few out there, we gave some awards to them at our last Pioneering Leader Summit, is we're seeing that the top leaders have really modeled an integrated career. Not every single one has to, but some need to. Not just preach, but model. And that what they've learned how to do is to be strategically responsive. And that really the assumption is that they would not work evenings and weekends, but there's going to be periods of episodic overwork where once in a while, once a quarter, once every year, it depends on the type of work you do, where yeah, there's going to be a lot of work that needs to get done, and yeah, that lawyer's probably going to work a lot of hours that week or month, but it's not chronic overwork. And what we've really learned from these flexible workplaces is the importance of vacations and really learning how to really turn off work on vacation or significantly turn off work on vacation, because it turns out the more you've helped people take those pauses, the more what we heard Erin talk about, you create these knowledge workers who can be more creative and thoughtful and figure out more effective ways to get their work done. And so it turns out these norms of these fully flexible workplaces actually help avoid chronic overwork. There's lots more I could say about a couple of different work cultures. I'm going to skip that slide, but I'm going to go to the slide where I talk about these contrasting work cultures. And again, the exciting story today is that there's more and more of these fully flexible work cultures. And what we want to do is keep on growing more of them, because it really proves that this is not a win-lose equation. This is something where organizations can do work better and employees can have time for their lives and the important work of caring for children or caring for aging parents or being involved with their community members. So we've learned a lot. I'm going to not talk a whole lot about it. I'm going to mention a little bit about what we've learned about how you avoid chronic overwork. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the leaders that we have involved with our work. And then I'm going to ask Kathy if she has anything she wants to add about the idea that we can avoid chronic overwork, a personal experience, a work experience, and I'll check in with Ellen. Then I'm going to ask Erin for her thoughts about all this. There is one more thing I want to talk about before we get to the end of the call, is how we can't just change the workplace. We also have to change norms at home. So we've got a few more things to get to, but plenty of time to do it. So how do you avoid chronic overwork? And this is something we're really telling you our brand new information. This is something we've been working hard at ThirdPath. We don't feel like we have all the answers. We have lots of good answers. And one is that we've learned the value of slower periods of work. So the more I listened to these progressive organizations, the more I learned that a slower period of work wasn't a sign that the workplace was failing. It was an opportunity to think smarter about how to get their work done, to find more effective ways to get their work done, to reprioritize what was important. And so there's been some learning we've been doing in our Pioneering Leaders group about the value of slower periods of work. And we've also learned to avoid chronic overwork that you can't do it by yourself. It's very hard. It's really something that people do as a team. In fact, there's a really great book, Sleeping with Your Smartphone, that talks about the value of a team thinking about this together. Even in a very work-first culture, that book was written about. And that what we've also learned is that there's some real value to notice that you're going towards chronic overwork and make a change sooner than later. And there's lots of stories I could give. One personal example is I always like to joke, you think we'd have it all figured out at ThirdPath, but we don't. One time we were totally headed towards chronic overwork, and my team and I really sat down and said, okay, we got to make a big change. And we did. We ended up deciding not to take on this one project we'd already started. And if we had done that like 3 months earlier, it would have made a really big difference for all of us. So even at ThirdPath, a very progressive workplace with very progressive people, we still had to learn some hard lessons. Kathy, any thoughts about this concept of, the importance of slower work periods, flexible work cultures? Are you hopeful that we're going to be seeing more of those? A quick comment or two, and then I'll ask Ellen.
Yes, I am. I mean, I think that that even when things, as a matter of fact, especially when work is somewhat chaotic, that's the perfect time for people to have flexibility, because we all have different peak productivity times, and to take advantage of being able to work effectively, you know, in a flexible situation, and take those breaks when you need them to kind of process where things are, and look at creative ways of getting work done, allowing us time to consider opportunities to delegate. There are all kinds of things that you can do and think creatively when you have flexibility, and I think more organizations are finding that to be the case.
Yeah, really well said. Excellent. And how about you, Ellen? What do you think about all this? Any hopeful or less hopeful stories, either way?
Well, I don't see a lot of change going on in the legal industry.
Yeah.
And I'm just reflecting on Erin's research and what you and Kathy have said. And this is not a novel idea. There's so much out there that talks about people will be more productive and efficient if they slow down, if they take time to reflect, if they take time to implement efficiencies. And when you're in a chronic overwork situation, of course, you don't do that.
Yep.
And the difference between the people who are working 50 to 60 hours a week and the people who are working 70 to 80 hours a week is that it takes longer. Once you become exhausted, you become less efficient.
Yeah.
And so those people are not doing more. They're not being more productive. They're taking longer to do it. In an organization that values time above what is produced during that time, then I don't see how that's going to change.
Yeah.
And so particularly in a billable hours culture. And it's interesting because there's so much pushback now from clients who are looking at, why is this amount of time spent, and trying to put limits on the amount of time that their lawyers spend on their matters. And that's not producing the kind of complementary change in the overwork culture that you would hope for. Instead, what happens is that there's pressure to just simply go out and bring in more work.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we have absolutely found in the work we've been doing together that this is a sticky, difficult problem. And I always joke with people that if I don't get to talk to them for a couple of weeks as my schedule is busy, not to worry, because all the problems we're trying to figure out aren't going to be going away that quickly. So, Erin, I'm going to let you share a couple thoughts. Before you do, I want to put one more slide up just to make one other important point, which is that what we've learned over the years is that there is this incredible opportunity for us to think smarter about the workplace, for sure. And that's the exciting work we've been doing with our Pioneering Leaders group and just a whole bunch of different communities at ThirdPath. But we've learned it also is going to take us thinking differently at home. In fact, the amazing story of all of our pioneering leaders is almost every single one of them started in a work-first work culture and then made change over time. They left that work culture, they invented their own new work culture, they created a new path inside that work culture, and one reason they were able to make that change, and I know this sounds like a Pollyanna answer, is because they had a really strong partnership at home about what they wanted, and they helped each other kind of, keep on reaching for that goal that they both wanted collectively around the role work would play in their lives and not letting work take over their lives. And so part of what was happening for them to be these creative, adventurous, pioneering leaders was that they had a really strong relationship at home saying, let's try it differently, let's do things differently. And so we're not spending a lot of time talking about that today, but I think it's a really important thing to put on the table. So Erin, you've been listening to Kathy and Ellen. You've heard some more things about work first or flexible work cultures. What else would you like to add that echoes from your research or your own experiences?
Sure. I think I'm actually very positive on change. I think change is going to happen. I think the level of attention that Overwork is getting in the public media, coupled with the kind of comments that you see on articles in newspapers about overwork cultures, and I guess I'm thinking specifically about the recent coverage of Amazon's culture of overwork in the New York Times a few weeks ago. That got a huge amount of attention. I think people care a lot. I think we're reaching a tipping point. The fact that everyone is working on their phones at home and their laptops at home, I think it's finally gotten to a point where people are working so much that they're starting to question if there's a new way to work. And so I think we're going to see more change. So I'm positive. I'm sad about all the people working 90 hours a week right now, but I think there will be some change. I was really struck by Catherine Myers' comment in the chat box about how this overwork relates to the ways that professional class families enroll their children in schools that emphasize busy schedules, striving, and achievement. And it rings so true to me. My children, my oldest son just entered kindergarten, and I've really been struck by what the school system emphasizes and how it sort of plays into this culture of overwork. And so I think you're right, Jessica, to link this to needing to make changes at home, and I think attending to the ways that we teach this in future generations is also important.
Yeah. Thank you, Kathy Myers, for that wonderful point, because I used to joke for years that we were a slacker family because I really tried to have our kids do a whole lot of nothing after school. And same with my husband, and it turns out that was really important and very countercultural. So absolutely, I think it's the kind of choices we're making for our kids and as parents and as a couple. Absolutely wonderful. Well, cool. There's a couple other small points we're going to make, and then what I'm going to do is I love having our greeters share a question or a comment. And so I've framed it one particular way. I'll talk about in a second, and then I'm going to set it up so that Sean and then Paul can have a comment. So I just wanted to mention that if you're listening today, we've been working hard as an organization to try to help people make changes around this, and that there's a couple of things you can access ThirdPath for. One is we have a simple handout that we'd be happy to send you. You can email us at timeforlife, life at thirdpath.org, and we can send you this handout called Pushing Back at Overwhelm, and it's a pretty cool way to start thinking about how you can make it more effective approach to work than just being chronically overworked. And we also have a pretty amazing call called our Overwhelm Mitigation Groups, OMG groups, where we help people learn some of these skills that we've learned from the pioneering leaders about how they too can work more effectively. So our OMG calls are something that people might be interested in as well. So let's check in. Why is it so hard for men and women to follow an integrated approach? Any thoughts about that, Sean? I'd love to hear your thoughts. I'm going to unmute you in a second, and then afterwards I want to hear from Paul. And then what we're going to do is get to question and answer more broadly. But Sean, any thoughts that you want to share with us? And maybe you have a different point of view on it.
Yeah, I mean, with respect to your question, it's absolutely cultural, and given what I do, I get to kind of pop into some of North America's and the world's largest companies fairly often, and you just see it's systemic, and even in places where there are policies that are well-intentioned, often behaviors just don't necessarily line up. That said, I do think I agree with Erin that I'm relatively optimistic as far as the way things are moving. I think the fact that I'm on this call right now, is probably a good example of someone who read something, who identified, who's keen to get involved. I probably exist within an organization that sits somewhere between work first and fully flexible. I guess I didn't go out of my way to trumpet that I'm on this call right now, so I guess I could quote unquote be passing. But I think that I think that I'm relatively optimistic. I think that the culture is shifting. I'm in a decently senior role here, and I think that we do our best to, myself and my colleagues in those roles, we do our best to kind of set an example that that people can follow. So yeah, I think it's purely cultural. I think it's going to be it's a long way from changing over, but I think there is a new breed of organizations that are are pushing towards that fully flexible.
Yeah, great, good. Glad to hear. I like optimism. I think that's very important. And what I'm going to do is unmute everybody so that we can hear from Paul, because I think the reason I can't see him on the list is because he's dialed in. And before you go, Paul, I know that Ellen has to get off the call at 2 o'clock. And so we're going to also say a quick something we liked or learned from the call and appreciation from the call. So I'm unmuting everybody. And Paul, I'm hoping we can hear from you. And what do you think about why is it so hard for men, or what insights would you like to share, Paul? Okay, I couldn't see Paul's name on the list. Just checking if you're there, Paul. Okay, he might have had a technical problem. So Sean, I'm going to go back to you before we open it up for the group. I love having somebody say something they appreciated from the call so far. And so I'm going to ask you for a quick appreciation from the call, and then we're going to open it up for the group to ask questions. What's something you really appreciated hearing about today, Sean?
Well, I need a little bit. I think that one of the things that I love about Erin's research is that this notion of sort of performance and balance and a relationship between those two things is, for me, the holy grail in order to build a business case for this sort of thing. And it seems like, the more that these studies are gaining attention, the better. I just had a quick question with relation to that. You had mentioned that there was less women who were quote unquote passing. I'm just curious if there was the same relationship as far as them performing at a level equal or above as the men who are passing, because in my mind that's a great case to make for time away or following those creative pursuits, as you mentioned.
Yeah, I saw performance at the same level for men and women.
Okay, cool.
Great question. Hey, so we're at the point in time where I'm going to stop the recording. And if you've been listening in today, please contact ThirdPath Institute if we can help you in any way find more effective ways to approach work and family. And now stay on, we'll have some more questions for Erin and the other speakers.